Greetings, Layrong Generation kids, it's your local Trash Panda Slayer here. Today I want to talk about a video game console that is well before my time. The Nintendo Entertainment System. If you are a gamer over 40, there's a good chance that this was one of the first consoles you played. During the late 80s and early 90s, there was no competition. It was either Nintendo or nothing. As for us younger folks, this console was the nostalgic behemoth in the YouTube game reviewing scene of the late 2000s and early 2010s. Most notably the angry video game nerd, who's famous for tearing apart the very worst this system has to offer. With angry reviews on NES games being many under 30's first exposure to the console, it's safe to say that many of us youngsters aren't interested in the system or its games, not helped by the astronomical prices they go for online. But one thing that will really turn the youths off from the NES library is the insane difficulty present on the majority of its games. This system is notorious for its unfair, poorly programmed, almost unplayable games. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely some gems on this system. Mega Man 2 and Super Mario Bros. 3 still withstand the test of time, but 90% of this console's repertoire has aged like milk. Actually, scratch that. Most of these games were never good to begin with. The only reason kids kept playing these games back in the day was because it was the only thing they had. That and the Game Genie making these games slightly more playable. But why exactly were NES games so difficult? Well, that can be due to one of four reasons. Poor programming, to pad out game time, technical limitations, and occasionally, to give the player a challenge. That's rare in this system's library, however. So let's start off with the issue of poor programming. Shovelware existed as far back as the Atari 2600, but it really got out of hand during the NES era, when almost any movie, TV show, or even book would get its own poorly made licensed game. I mean, who asked for a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde video game? What's next? Are they gonna make a tie-in game for some Hallmark Channel holiday special? Is the Weather Channel gonna get their own licensed game? These licensed games tended to be the very worst the NES had to offer, with the biggest offender being a bunch of laughing, joking numbnuts named LJN. They never developed any games of their own, merely published them, but it just seems like they intentionally chose the very worst games to publish. It's almost like they got a kick out of ruining people's childhoods. Bastards. The NES was the first console to sell over 50 million units, and with that push towards mainstream ubiquity, it was the point where no-talent hacks decided to get into game design, to see if they could rip off kids and their uninitiated parents. A good example would be Action 52, the result of some out-of-touch businessman rounding up 3 or 4 college kids to make a game in merely 3 months. And it really shows. Not a single game on this multi-cart works properly, with some of them refusing to even load on authentic hardware. I would rather eat an entire Arby's meat mountain than play this game. I'd have more fun drinking a Sonic pickle slush than playing this pile of hippo turds. Did you ever wish that the Where's Waldo books had their own video game? No, you didn't? Well, too bad. The good old NES had one. Have fun trying to find out which blob of 4 pixels is Waldo. Did this really need to exist? Who asked for this? Probably the worst example of a licensed game that didn't need to exist is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A game so mind-bogglingly unfair that I'm 90% certain this game was literally made to troll people. As Dr. Jekyll, it's virtually impossible to hurt anything with your only means of attack, a wimpy little walking cane, and everyone is out to get you. It's an endless barrage of enemies that's nearly impossible to avoid. And if you die and turn into Hyde, that's a short-lived affair, as that will end once you reach the point you died as Jekyll, bringing you back to the usual unfair gameplay. Either they didn't know what they were doing, or knew exactly what they were doing and just wanted to piss you off. Padding out game time. NES cartridges could only hold less than 1 megabyte of data. This picture that I am currently putting up on screen takes up more storage space than the biggest official NES game. With that in mind, it's no surprise that NES games tend to be very short if you know what you're doing, so to pad out the short game time, devs often made games hard to artificially lengthen them. Infamously hard games such as Ninja Gaiden and Battletoads can be beaten in 30 minutes or less if you're an expert, but I think it's safe to say most people aren't going to achieve that on their first playthrough. Everyone knows this by now, but you can beat Super Mario 1 in 5 minutes by using warp pipes. Granted, I wouldn't consider SMB1 to be that hard of a game, and I think NES devs realize this and decide to make their games super hard as a result. I mean, when you're working with limited space and can only fit 6 to 8 levels on the cartridge, what else could you do? There's also the fact that video game rentals were very common during the late 80s and early 90s, so people would often rent a game for a week before having to return it to their local Blockbuster. Remember those? Imagine renting a game and then beating it in an hour or less. This was another reason for devs making their games so difficult. Of course, there's another big elephant in the room in regards to NES difficulty: technical limitations. This may come as a surprise, but the NES wasn't a very powerful console. Even back in its day, arcade games were already achieving 16-bit graphics that were 5 years ahead of the curve, but the NES was more or less the only home console that mattered in the latter half of the 80s. Atari were already has-beens, with their 7800 model never taking off, and only Brazilians bought the Sega Master System. That's not a joke, by the way. That system is pretty much iconic in that country, but pretty much unknown anywhere else. From 1985 to 1990, it was literally Nintendo or nothing else for home consoles. The technical limitations meant that games very rarely had save features or even mid-level checkpoints. The most you'd get were passwords, and those were often long and confusing just to add to the frustration. Combine that with antiquated live systems appearing in even the most brutal of games, and you've got a library that's tailor-made for people with Stockholm Syndrome. Is it any wonder why people use save states on emulators? To some, this is a sin, and anyone caught doing it should be waterboarded, but to many more, however, it's the only way you can get enjoyment out of the majority of NES games, given the antiquated nature of them. There are games on this system with save features, such as Legend of Zelda and Kirby's Adventure, and the Super Mario Bros. Games had mid-level checkpoints, but most games aren't fortunate enough to have these features. In spite of my complaints regarding difficulty, I do actually believe that difficulty can be an art form if pulled off correctly. Given the glut of games ever since 2008 or so that treat players like toddlers, I actually enjoyed some of the more challenging NES games. It really depends on how well they pull it off. I've really been enjoying Rockin' Cats, an early furry mascot platformer with unique gameplay and an amazing old-school cartoon feel. It's the kind of game whose challenge will make you into a better gamer, just the way I like it. I also really enjoy Castlevania. I'm more into Symphony of the Night personally, but the first Castlevania is totally worth the hype and stands the test of time as one of the NES's greatest games. Captain Skyhawk is another one of my faves. Sure, you die in one hit, and you'll need a turbo controller to truly enjoy this game, but it's just such a great game that I enjoy coming back to time and time again. There are definitely games that showcase the challenging but fair side of the NES library, but even back then, there were devs who made games difficult just to be douchebags. Take Silver Surfer, for example. A game so cartoonishly unfair that I was barely able to make it 10 seconds into a level without dying. They turned Silver Surfer into a blubbering idiot who falls to his knees crying if he so much as stubs his toe. This game sucks the milk out of a cow's udders. I would rather eat a triple whopper from Burger King with extra mayonnaise than play this game. I think it's safe to say that games like this are the reason some gamers think all games need to be super unfair. They played them as little kids and developed Stockholm Syndrome as a result. The NES era is unfortunately marred by a library of poorly programmed and unfair games, among other issues. And it's a hard sell to younger gamers who are still stuck using training wheels. If you ask me, video games didn't become truly great until the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, where shovelware was less common and most game devs finally figured out how to make decent games. I still respect the NES for what it contributed to in the gaming landscape, but I can't deny that it's not exactly the best console to invest money into these days. When it comes to all the shovelware, expensive games, and poorly programmed dreck that this system has to offer, I think it's best to just stick to emulation. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. I tried to give it a bit of a 2009 feel to it, hence why it's in 4:3 aspect ratio. Plus, it helps with the footage of the NES games. Feel free to let me know if you'd like to see more reviews on that console. It'd be a good break from my usual PS1 and 2 stuff. And if you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, feel free to donate to me on Ko-fi. This is SlayerCoon, signing out.